Hello, Lit students. I thought I'd take a moment and continue our discussion now that we have a day's worth of readings, what might actually be the equivalent of a week's worth of readings in the books, and we're looking towards the second day or week two. There are a number of resources and a video that I wanted you to read and watch, and I'm going to use those a little bit in this video to help us to perform a reading of Emily Dickinson's Because I Could Not Stop for Death, as a sort of an example of what I would consider a first reading. That is, going into a text like a poem, reading it aloud, which I will do, and then sort of using the guide that's established in how to read a poem for us to sort of think about some things that we initially see. I want to start, however, by referencing the how do we analyze literature video, YouTube video. One thing that I wanted to, sorry, that's lightning and thunder, it's raining here. One thing that I wanted to sort of use as a preface for when we talk about literature and poetry and fiction is the concept of analysis. So in that video, they define analysis, and I agree. I think it's a good definition of analysis. And I'm going to paraphrase as looking at a whole, the meaning of a whole, by considering how the parts work. So for a poem, the reading from the University of Wisconsin Writing Center, Madison Writing Center, titled How Do We Read a Poem, provides us with the tools to perform an initial reading analysis, but then also to sort of dig a little bit deeper. Remember, the purpose of an analysis is to better understand how the text works. But as living human beings with brains and experiences, we're bringing something to the reading as well. Meaning is a construction. It's a compromise, if you will. But there are ways in which our readings can be incorrect, right? And so the whole idea of a literary analysis is we have to root it in the details of the text. Okay, and so what I want to do is I want to use that. How do we read a poem to help us look for things that are in the text to ground us in initial reading that might then help us to identify places that we can dig a little bit deeper as we perform, let's say, a second reading or an analysis. All right, so I'm going to start by reading the poem aloud because I think it's important to do that. You have to hear it. Poetry is meant to be heard. Because I Could Not Stop for Death, Emily Dickinson. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun, or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling in the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. Okay, so as we read this aloud, we get a sense of the sound and the rhythm, and this is one of the things for sure that I'm going to talk a little bit about. It's in the How to Read a Poem, Sound and Rhythm. But I want to start with the title. That's where it suggests we go first. So Emily Dickinson's title of this poem is Because I Could Not Stop for Death. It's pretty typical of her to use the first line of the poem as the title of the poem. They're actually all entitled poems. And when they got anthologized or published, the editors just took the first line of the poem and used that as the title. So that's something to know about Emily Dickinson, is that she didn't title her poems, if you will. Okay, so what is the initial subject right? What's our first impression subject? I'm gonna expand this a little bit and say when I do an initial reading, I'm looking at where does my eye and interest get drawn. So it's not just the subject. I don't just want to be able to paraphrase the subject, but I want to think about things that as I'm reading it, I'm noting in my mind. Those are sort of notes or annotations, line notes that I'm going to eventually come back to. I might put a check there. I might underline it. I might do something like that so that I can come back to it. So there are really three things that I wanted to focus on here as part of the initial subject. So one is that I think that this poem is about death and eternal life. It's a pretty heavy topic, one that exists in many cultures. Doesn't just have to be religious, but in many cultures it's tied to religion, and that is what happens to us after we die. Obviously, this poem presents a particular perspective, and I of that journey, and that's the second thing, is that this death itself is a journey. It's not the end. It's not the beginning, it is itself a journey, and that's an interesting way of thinking about it, because don't we think about life as a journey? Can we think about death also as a journey? It asks, what is the purpose of life? We might then ask, what is the purpose of the journey of death? It's interesting. It makes us think about those things. And a couple other things that I notice here about form and language. She has some weird things with what she capitalizes. Look at the first thing. Death is capitalized. Carriage is capitalized. Ourselves, immortality. We can go all the way down. What I might do is I might write down all the capitalized words, not the ones that begin sentences, but the other ones. So death, carriage, ourselves, immortality, civility, children, recess, fields, gazing grain, ring, setting, sun, he, dews, gossamer, gown, tippet, tool, etc. See if there's something in there. What kinds of words are those? What are they suggesting? And so then, as we get into language, first let's talk about sound and rhythm. As we read this around aloud, we definitely do get a particular rhythm. It's very conversational. The mood itself is, I think, the perfect word for it is somber. All right. So if you don't know what that means, you can look that up. But think about the somber mood. It's a serious tone. It's reflective. We might think who the speaker is. The speaker is the person who has recently passed, who is in some ways narrating this journey for us of being picked up in a carriage by death to begin death's journey. There's personification of death, of immortality as a living thing. Here, human. Death stopped for me. Immortality is a character who's going along on this journey, eternity, those sorts of things. Right? But think about if you were getting ready to take a trip. All right, let's say you're taking a cab, or you're going to a drive, or you're going to get on an airplane. And let's say that it's to college for the first time. You're leaving a lot behind. That initial trip might be somber. That is, it's you're sad, but you're still looking forward to something. You're eager, maybe a little there's a little trepidation. It's not fearful, but you're definitely it's thoughtful, introspective, retrospective. Somber. So I think that's something to think about. That's the tone and the mood. And that helps us to define what kind of journey this is when we talk about it later. Okay, let's talk about language. We've already mentioned capitalization. We've talked about personification. Look at some of the particular words in the personification of death. I ask you in your discussion questions to think, what kind of character is death? Is death what kind of a person is death? Well, death kindly stopped, right? And asked her to put away her labor and her work for his civility. That's interesting. So we have, right, it asks us to think about the ways that our cultures define death, and the Grim Reaper with the scythe mowing down grain. Grain's in here as well. But I think it's interesting if we just look at some of the words. So death kindly stopped. They drove slowly. They were not in a rush. There was no haste. Asked her to put away her work and for his civility. That's interesting. A little bit later, here we have the dews drew quivering and chill. Obviously, that's meant to tell us what we can talk about setting. But here this gives the language here. Gossamer is her gown, and tippet her tippetous tulle. You can look those words up. I suggest that you look those up if you don't know what they mean. I think it's helpful to tell us what happened. I mean, her gown was gossamer and her tippet was tulle. Well, that's clothing. When would you wear a gossamer gown in a tulle tippet, right? Bedtime. That's a nightgown. So it tells us a little bit about maybe when she passed and how she's dressed. That's interesting. I think the final thing that I want to think about here is that the house. It's called we paused before a house. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. Why would this journey pause? There's a sight to see, or maybe they're picking someone else up. Who might you pick up? What kind of a house would be a swelling of the ground? Interesting. I think that we can talk about illusions here. The illusion of a grave that's recently dug and mounded over. We could talk about a swelling of the belly. All right. So there's this life and death cycle that's happening here. So I think that's all intended. So when we look at language, we have to think about connotation, just like when we were looking at in the station of a metro. At the station of a metro, at a metro, I mentioned in that video that it's important for us to think about why those words and define those words, and then what else could be there as a better way of understanding why those words. So swelling is an interesting thing here. And then finally, obviously, it's been centuries. The horses' heads were turned towards eternity. We know what that means. All right, so language. Action. All right. The next thing that the reading asks us to think about is action. What is happening here? Well, we've already talked about this. This is a journey. Where is it a journey to? It begs the question. Eternity. It's a journey towards eternity. That's an interesting way of defining what this journey of death is. Another thing to think about is that it lasts for centuries. It has been centuries and yet feels shorter than the day. What does that tell us? Right? It's a very interesting sort of a thing. It's definitely a different kind of time than we're used to. The thing I think that we have to think about with this journey is what kind of a journey it is, who's on the journey, all those things, where are they headed, what's the purpose of this journey is, what are they passing along the way? All right, so what do they see? They see children playing, right? They see children playing. They're striving at recess in the rain. Okay, that's interesting. We pass fields of gazing grain. We pass the setting sun, or rather he passes us. And then we pass the swelling house in the ground. So I think that my thoughts would go towards those things. I think it's interesting to think about. And then finally, figurative languages. Figurative language. This entire poem is one metaphor about the journey of death. Death as a journey as a metaphor. So we have to think about what a metaphor is. A metaphor is an allusion comparing one thing to another, or asking us to think about one thing in one way that we might have seen it, that we might think about it another. It's not likening to it, but it's saying it is that thing. So here we have the death as a metaphor, or journey as metaphor for death. Very, very simple. But within that metaphor, we have other sorts of figurative things happening. We have personification, we have imagery, we have illusion, we have all those sorts of things. We have symbolism, we have all those things. So this helps us all to set the stage for what I would say is an initial reading of this poem, thinking about a critical reading isn't just it can mean what I want it to mean, but rather we use what we know about how poetry works to ask it questions. And that's what I mean when I say to interrogate a text. So a first reading is really an interrogation. You go into it thinking about certain kinds of things in the way that the poem works. You begin a process of analysis by thinking about how the title works, by reading it aloud, by listening to the sound of the rhythm, by taking notes on those things, by thinking about language and the action of it, the speaker of it, the characters, the setting. You think about what the initial purposes are, all towards this what does it mean? So what? Who cares? All right. So we're a lot closer now to being able to sort of read this again, dig into it, and try to get at that. What would we say about this if we were to write about it? And that's really where we're headed. Is each time I have you do a reading, I want you to think about the frame as getting us towards a better and closer and deeper understanding of the way that the poem can mean, given certain criteria about how poetry has been known to mean. We'll do the same thing with fiction here. I'll do a video, similar video using the elements of fiction for Hills Like White Elephants, which is the other reading for this that's due tomorrow. But anyway, if you have any questions about anything that I've said or about the poem itself or anything else, please let me know. Feel free to email me. Feel free to reach out. Thank you very much for listening.